The airport was an ocean of sound and movement, hurried footsteps, the murmur of voices, and the occasional ding from the overhead speaker announcing boarding gates. Ethan clutched his worn backpack tighter against his chest as he walked beside his Aunt Rachel. The 12-year-old boy looked around, his dark eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and anxiety. He was about to fly across the country to visit his dad, who he hadn't seen in nearly a year since the long custody battle had started. "Aunt Rachel, are you sure this is the right gate?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice barely rising above the noise. Rachel smiled down at him, her eyes warm despite the long flight ahead. "Don't worry, buddy. We're right where we need to be." Rachel had been Ethan's rock through the tumultuous months following his parents' divorce. She was calm, always encouraging, and Ethan felt safer with her around. But despite her presence, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. Rachel led him to a set of plastic chairs near their gate. The airport buzzed around them, passengers of all kinds rushing past, dressed in business suits, fashionable jackets, or comfortable travel clothes. Ethan glanced at his own outfit, a superhero t-shirt and jeans, paired with his favorite sneakers. Compared to some of the other travelers, he felt a little out of place. He tugged at the sleeve of Rachel's worn denim jacket. "Aunt Rachel," he whispered, "do you think we should have dressed up more?" Rachel chuckled softly. "Sweetheart, there's no dress code for flying. We're comfortable, and that's what matters. Besides, we've got a long flight ahead of us." Ethan nodded, but his nerves didn't ease. He wasn't just worried about what people thought of him. He was nervous about seeing his dad again, about how things would feel between them after the past year of courtrooms and custody disputes. As they waited, Ethan's eyes wandered. A little girl in a frilly dress twirled around, giggling as her parents watched. An older couple in pressed suits read quietly from their newspapers. He noticed people glancing at him and his aunt occasionally, and the knot in his stomach grew tighter. Rachel noticed his silence and reached over, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" He hesitated, unsure of how to express what he was feeling. "I'm excited to see Dad, but what if things are weird? What if he's different now?" Rachel's expression softened. She pulled Ethan into a side hug, her arm draped protectively around his small shoulders. "Your dad loves you, Ethan. That hasn't changed. This trip is a chance for you two to spend time together, have some fun, and catch up. It's going to be okay." Ethan leaned into her embrace, feeling the warmth of her reassurance. He knew Rachel was right. She always was. But still, the uncertainty gnawed at him. Flight 486 to Atlanta is now boarding. The loudspeaker crackled above them. Ethan's heart thumped harder in his chest. This was it. He and Rachel gathered their bags and joined the line of passengers waiting to board the plane. Ethan felt like he was in a dream as they shuffled forward. He imagined what it would be like to finally see his dad again after all this time. His father had sent a few texts, promising a fun weekend, but they hadn't spoken much. The silence had left Ethan with a lot of questions that the trip might answer. The boarding process was slow, and by the time they reached their seats, Ethan felt both relieved and anxious. They found their row toward the middle of the plane. Rachel motioned toward the window seat. "You can have the window seat if you want," she offered, her voice as calming as always. Ethan's face lit up. "Really, thanks, Aunt Rachel." He slid into the seat, pressing his face against the oval window. The outside world looked so different from up here. The baggage carts zooming across the tarmac looked like toy cars, and the runway seemed to stretch on forever. The view distracted him from his nervousness, if only for a moment. Rachel settled into the middle seat beside him, busy organizing their bags and snacks. Ethan watched passengers file down the narrow aisle, a parade of strangers. He noticed their clothes. Some travelers were in sharp suits, others in casual wear like him. A few people glanced their way, but he quickly looked away, hoping not to draw too much attention. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair took the aisle seat next to Rachel. She smiled warmly at Ethan. "Hello there, young man. Looks like we'll be neighbors for this flight." Ethan, remembering his manners, smiled back, though it was small and shy. "Hi, I'm Ethan. This is my first time flying." The woman's eyes sparkled with delight. "Well, You're in for quite an adventure. Mrs. Langley. Where are you headed? To see my dad, Ethan said, and despite his nerves, he found himself telling her a bit more about the trip. As they chatted, Ethan's earlier anxiety began to ease. Mrs. Langley was kind and interested in his stories. For a brief moment, it felt like a normal, exciting trip. Just as Ethan was starting to feel comfortable, a sudden jolt rocked the plane, and he realized it was just the aircraft pulling back from the gate. His heart raced again, but this time with excitement. The plane rumbled to life as it taxied toward the runway. Rachel smiled at Ethan, giving his hand a squeeze. You're doing great, buddy. Deep breaths. Ethan followed her advice, but just as he was about to respond, a flight attendant approached their row. Her name tag read Stephanie, and her expression was tight, her eyes scanning over Rachel and Ethan in a way that made Ethan uncomfortable. Stephanie's gaze lingered on their casual clothes, her lips pursed. Everything all right here? She asked, her tone polite but lacking any warmth. Rachel smiled up at her. We're all set, thank you. Stephanie gave a curt nod, but there was something in her eyes, something judgmental. She glanced at Ethan again, her eyes narrowing. It was as if she was silently accusing him of something. Ethan felt a pang of self-consciousness. He shifted in his seat, trying to make himself smaller. Mrs. Langley, sensing the tension, gave a reassuring smile to both Rachel and Ethan. The plane took off, and for a while things seemed normal. Ethan gazed out the window, watching the ground fall away as they soared into the clouds. He felt a flicker of excitement. The idea that he was flying through the sky was amazing. But that sense of wonder shattered not long into the flight. As the flight attendants began their rounds with the beverage carts, Ethan reached down to grab his backpack from under the seat. In doing so, his elbow bumped the tray of drinks the attendant was holding. A small splash of water spilled onto the floor, and Stephanie, who was nearby, whipped her head around, her eyes immediately locking onto him. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp. "That was very careless. Please sit still." Ethan froze, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. Rachel looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It was an accident," she said calmly. "He was just reaching for his bag." Stephanie's expression hardened. "I've had enough disruptions from your row already. If you can't control your child, you'll have to take action." Rachel's face tightened. "My nephew hasn't done anything wrong." But Stephanie wasn't listening. She marched down the aisle, and moments later, another attendant appeared, this one with a stern look and a more official stance. The tension in the air was palpable. "What's going on here?" Rachel asked, standing up now, her voice steady but filled with frustration. The new attendant, speaking with authority, said, "Mom, we've received complaints about disruptive behavior from your row. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." Rachel's face went pale. "What? That's absurd. My nephew has done nothing wrong." Other passengers began to turn and whisper, some looking confused, others judging. Ethan sank lower into his seat, his entire body trembling. He wished he could disappear, but Rachel's voice remained strong as she continued to stand up for him. "This is completely unacceptable," she said. "We have every right to be on this flight." By now, a few passengers, including Mrs. Langley, tried to intervene. "I've been sitting here the whole time," she said firmly. "This young boy hasn't caused any trouble." They were back at the gate, sitting in plastic chairs that felt colder than before. The airport around them was still bustling, but to Ethan, everything seemed distant, like he was trapped in a bubble of shock and disbelief. Rachel had her phone out, pacing back and forth as she spoke to her lawyer friend, Jonathan. Her voice was firm, but Ethan could see the frustration etched on her face. He wanted to cry, to scream, to run away from the shame that still clung to him like a second skin. A tap on his shoulder made him look up. It was the woman from the plane, Mrs. Langley. Her kind eyes were filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry for what happened, sweetheart," she said softly. "It wasn't right." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Just then, another woman approached, someone younger, holding her phone in her hand. "I was sitting a few rows behind you," she said, her voice tinged with anger. "I recorded the whole thing. This shouldn't have happened." She showed them the video she had taken on her phone. It was a shaky recording, but it clearly captured the moment Stephanie had accused Ethan. as well as the looks of confusion from other passengers. Rachel's eyes darkened as she watched the footage. "Can you send that to me?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but laced with frustration. The woman nodded and quickly forwarded the video. As she did, Rachel's phone buzzed again, Jonathan calling back. Ethan overheard snippets of her conversation, words like discrimination and lawsuit. But he could barely focus on that. His mind was still stuck on the plane, reliving every embarrassing second. The woman who had recorded the video, her name was Megan, stepped away, but not before saying, "I'm posting this online. People need to see what really happened." Rachel hung up the phone and sat back down next to Ethan, placing a hand on his back. "We're going to fix this, Ethan. I promise." But Ethan wasn't so sure. Even though Rachel was strong and determined, he still felt so small and powerless. The video, the phone calls, the promises of justice, they all felt like distant ideas that couldn't touch the shame burning inside him. He slumped down in his seat, the weight of the day pressing hard against his chest. But even in his sadness, there was a small, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But Stephanie and the other flight attendant were relentless. "We're calling security," they said. And just like that, Ethan's worst fear came true. Minutes later, security arrived, and in front of the entire plane, Ethan and Rachel were escorted off. Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he stumbled down the aisle, hearing the whispers and feeling the stares of every passenger. His heart was pounding, his cheeks flushed with humiliation. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of his Aunt Rachel's phone buzzing incessantly. He rubbed his eyes and sat up in bed, trying to shake off the remnants of a restless sleep. Rachel was pacing near the window, her phone glued to her ear. Yes, I'll call you back in a moment," Rachel said, her voice tight with frustration, but also an underlying urgency. When she hung up, she turned to Ethan, her expression softening when she saw his tired face. "Good morning, buddy," she said, her tone gentle but distracted. "What's going on?" Aunt Rachel Ethan asked, his voice still groggy. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "Remember that video Megan took? It's gone viral, Ethan." "Like really viral?" Ethan blinked in confusion. "Viral? What does that mean?" Rachel sat down on the edge of the bed, her eyes searching his face. "It means millions of people have seen what happened to us. They're outraged, Ethan. People all over the country are talking about it. News channels want to interview us. Civil rights organizations are reaching out." The words swirled in Ethan's head, but they didn't make much sense. Yesterday, he'd been a kid humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers. Now millions of people knew his name. It was overwhelming. "I don't understand," Ethan said quietly. "Why do they care about me?" Rachel took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Because what happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. And people are finally starting to wake up and see that." Ethan's heart raced. The idea of being at the center of such attention made his stomach turn. "But I didn't do anything," he whispered, as if trying to convince himself. Rachel's eyes softened. "Exactly. And that's why they care. You didn't do anything wrong, but you were treated like you did. That's not okay." Just then, Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Jonathan," she said, standing up and walking out of the room to take the call. Ethan sat there, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anxiety. He reached for his own phone and opened it to find hundreds of notifications. His friends from school had texted him, asking if it was really him in the video. There were also comments from strangers, some offering support, others just as confused as he was. Curious, Ethan opened up a social media app and searched for his name. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the first headline, "12-year-old black boy kicked off plane in shocking incident, nation demands justice." There were hashtags with his name. Thousands of people were sharing the video, demanding that the airline be held accountable. Ethan's face, captured in that moment of humiliation, was plastered all over the internet. He shut the phone off and buried his face in his hands. It was all too much. 2 days later, Ethan and Rachel sat in a sleek downtown office across from their lawyer, Jonathan. The man's serious expression made Ethan nervous, though Jonathan had always been kind to him. Rachel was talking to Jonathan about the legal ramifications of what had happened on the plane. Ethan tried to listen, but the grown-up words like civil suit and discrimination blurred together in his mind. His thoughts kept drifting back to the night before, when he'd stayed up late reading comments online. Some people were angry on his behalf, but others said things that made him feel even smaller than before. They questioned whether what happened was really about race, or if it was just a misunderstanding. Jonathan's deep voice cut through his thoughts. The good news is, the video gives us strong evidence of what happened. The airline has already started doing damage control. But we need to decide how to move forward. Rachel leaned in, her eyes sharp. What are our options? We can file a lawsuit against the airline for discrimination. It's clear that Ethan was singled out without cause, and the video makes that obvious. But, Jonathan added, it won't be easy. They'll fight back hard, and the airline is already preparing a defense. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. Defense, he asked, his voice small. What do they have to defend? Jonathan turned to him, his expression softening. They'll try to argue that what happened was just a mistake, or that it had nothing to do with your race. But we know better. Rachel's jaw clenched, but she nodded. What do we need to do? Jonathan sat back in his chair, folding his hands together. We'll need witness statements, more evidence, and we'll have to be ready for a long legal process. The airline might also counter-sue, claiming we're damaging their reputation. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. This sounded so big, so serious. What if we lose? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel turned to him, her eyes full of determination. We won't lose. No matter what happens, we're doing the right thing. We're standing up for what's right. Jonathan nodded. That's true. And remember, we're not alone in this. People are rallying behind you, Ethan. The video went viral because people saw the injustice. That's powerful. Ethan didn't feel powerful, though. He felt small, like a tiny piece of a much bigger machine. But he nodded anyway, trusting his aunt and Jonathan to guide him through whatever came next. In the days that followed, the world outside seemed to move faster than Ethan could keep up with. The story continued to gain traction, with media outlets picking up the video and running stories on what had happened. Rachel had received numerous requests for interviews, and after discussing it with Jonathan, she agreed to appear on a popular morning talk show. Ethan, they want you to come too, Rachel told him as they sat together on the couch at home. It'll be just a short segment, but they want to hear from you. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. I don't know if I can do that, Aunt Rachel. I'm not good at talking to people, especially not on TV. Rachel smiled, brushing a hand over his curls. You don't have to do it if you're not ready. But remember, your voice is important. People are listening because of what you went through. If you speak up, it might help others who've been through something similar. The idea of helping others stirred something in Ethan. He remembered the comments he'd seen online, people sharing their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. It made him feel like this was bigger than just what happened to him. Maybe, if he was brave enough, his voice could make a difference. When the day of the interview came, Ethan sat beside Rachel in the green room of the television studio, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Rachel gave his knee a reassuring pat as they waited to go on air. It's okay to be nervous, she said softly. Just remember, we're doing this together. Ethan nodded, swallowing his fear as the producer called them to the set. The lights were bright, the cameras intimidating, but the host was kind, her questions gentle. She asked Rachel about the experience first, letting Rachel explain what had happened on the flight and how they had been treated unfairly. Then she turned to Ethan. Ethan, I know this must have been very difficult for you, the host said, her voice warm. How are you feeling now after everything that's happened? Ethan looked down at his hands, his heart racing. But he remembered what Rachel had said. His voice was important. So he took a deep breath and began to speak. I didn't understand why it was happening at first, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper at first. I didn't know why I was being treated like that. I was just trying to get my book, and then everything felt like it was falling apart. I didn't do anything wrong, but they treated me like I did. The host nodded, her expression sympathetic. That must have been incredibly painful. Ethan nodded, feeling his throat tighten. It made me feel like I didn't belong, like I wasn't supposed to be there, just because of how I look. Rachel reached over and squeezed his hand, giving him a reassuring smile. Her strength gave him the courage to continue. But now, seeing how many people care about what happened, it makes me feel like maybe we can make things better, Ethan said, his voice growing steadier. I didn't want all this attention, but if it helps other kids like me, then I think it's worth it. The host smiled warmly at Ethan, her eyes filled with admiration. That's very brave of you, Ethan. Speaking up is never easy, but it's clear that your voice is making a big impact. After the interview, Rachel hugged Ethan tightly backstage. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. You did amazing. Ethan felt a strange mixture of relief and pride. Speaking on national television had been terrifying, but now that it was over, he felt like a weight had been lifted. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe his voice really could help make a difference. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the airline intensified. News outlets continued to cover the story, and civil rights groups began organizing protests and boycotts. The public outrage grew, with hashtags like Justice for Ethan trending on social media. Ethan and Rachel received messages of support from people all over the world. But the airline wasn't going to back down without a fight. One evening, as Rachel was going through her emails, she received a message from Jonathan. Her face tightened as she read it, and Ethan, sitting across the room, noticed the shift in her expression. Aunt Rachel, he asked hesitantly. What's wrong? Rachel sighed deeply, setting her phone down on the table. The airline is countersuing us, she said, her voice heavy with frustration. They're claiming that the video and the public attention have damaged their reputation. Ethan's stomach dropped. But we didn't do anything wrong. They were the ones who kicked us off the plane. Rachel nodded, her jaw clenched in anger. I know, Ethan, but this is how they're trying to fight back. They're saying we've caused them harm by speaking out. Ethan felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over him. Can they do that? Can they just sue us for telling the truth? Jonathan's voice came over the phone a few moments later, calm but serious. Yes, they can file the suit, but that doesn't mean they're in the right, he explained. They're hoping to intimidate us into backing down. It's a tactic to make us question whether this fight is worth it. Rachel's eyes flickered with determination. We're not backing down, she said firmly. We're going to fight this. Ethan looked at his aunt, his heart pounding in his chest. Part of him wanted to hide from all of this, to escape the constant pressure and attention. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger with each passing day, knew that they couldn't give up. Too many people were watching, and too many people were counting on them to stand up for what was right. What do we do now? Ethan asked quietly. Jonathan's voice was steady. We keep going. We'll prepare our case, gather more evidence, and we'll fight their countersuit just as hard as we're fighting for justice. As they hung up the phone, Rachel turned to Ethan with a determined look in her eyes. We're going to get through this, Ethan. We're not alone in this fight. Remember that. Ethan nodded, but the fear still lingered in the pit of his stomach. The idea of being dragged through a long legal battle was exhausting, and the weight of it pressed down on him. But as Rachel hugged him tightly, he realized that they couldn't stop now. They had already come so far. As the legal battle with the airline intensified, something remarkable began to happen. People from all over the country started to rally behind Ethan and Rachel. Activists organized protests outside the airline's headquarters, demanding accountability. News channels continued to cover the story, and social media was flooded with messages of support. One evening, as they sat together in their small living room, scrolling through the endless posts online, Ethan's eyes widened at the messages pouring in. People were sharing their own experiences of discrimination stories that mirrored his own. Some were from other passengers who had faced mistreatment on flights, while others were from people who had experienced racism in schools, workplaces, or even in their own neighborhoods. Aunt Rachel, look at all these stories, Ethan said, his voice filled with amazement. I didn't know so many people went through stuff like this. Rachel leaned over, her expression serious as she read some of the posts. It's more common than most people realize, Ethan. That's why this fight is so important. It's not just about us anymore. Ethan felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. The idea that his story had inspired so many people to come forward filled him with both pride and pressure. He didn't want to let them down. A few days later, Megan, the woman who had recorded the video, contacted Rachel and Ethan with an idea. She had organized a rally in their hometown, inviting community members to come together in support of their fight for justice. Ethan wasn't sure how he felt about standing in front of a crowd, but when Rachel told him about the rally, she gave him the choice. "You don't have to speak if you don't want to," Rachel said gently, "but if you do, this could be a chance for you to share your story in your own words." Ethan thought about it for a long time. The idea of standing in front of a crowd made his palms sweat, but he remembered how good it had felt after the television interview, how people had listened to him, how they had cared. Maybe this was another chance to make a difference. On the day of the rally, Ethan and Rachel arrived at the park where the event was being held. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Ethan" and "End Discrimination Now." The crowd cheered when they saw Ethan and Rachel arrive, and Megan waved them over to the stage. Ethan's heart raced as he stood behind the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces. Rachel stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The warmth of her presence gave him the courage to speak. "I'm not a big talker," Ethan began, his voice shaky at first, "but I wanted to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who's here today, and to everyone who has been supporting us." The crowd was silent, listening intently as Ethan continued. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone," he said, his voice growing stronger. "No one should be treated differently because of how they look. I didn't ask for all this attention, but if my story can help stop this from happening to someone else, then I'm glad people are listening." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a swell of pride in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel small. He felt powerful. He felt heard. After the rally, people lined up to talk to Ethan and Rachel, sharing their own stories and offering words of encouragement. Some of them were kids his age, who told him they had faced bullying or discrimination at school. Others were adults who had experienced similar injustices in their workplaces or daily lives. As Ethan listened to each person, he realized something important. This wasn't just his fight. It was everyone's fight. And together, they were stronger than any airline, stronger than any lawsuit. As they left the rally, Rachel looked down at Ethan with a proud smile. "You did amazing today," she said softly. Ethan smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thanks, Aunt Rachel," he said. "But we still have a long way to go, don't we?" Rachel nodded. "We do, but we're not alone. And that makes all the difference." The day of the trial was finally here. Ethan sat beside Rachel in the courthouse, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He glanced around the courtroom, taking in the formal atmosphere, the dark wooden benches, the heavy silence, the sense that something very important was about to happen. Rachel sat with her back straight, her face calm but intense. On the other side of the courtroom, the airline's lawyers, led by their chief attorney, Mr. Jacobs, sat flipping through papers, occasionally glancing over at Ethan and Rachel with dispassionate expressions. The tension was thick in the air. Jonathan sat beside them, quietly talking to their other attorney, Ava Morales, a brilliant civil rights lawyer they had brought in to strengthen their case. Ava had been preparing for weeks, and her confidence reassured Ethan. The judge entered, and the trial began. Ava started their side of the case, laying out the key points show Ethan had been unjustly targeted and humiliated, how the flight attendants' actions were discriminatory, and how the airline had failed to address the situation properly. She played the now infamous video that Megan had recorded, showing the court exactly how the incident had unfolded. The courtroom was silent as the video played, the harshness of Stephanie's words echoing in the air. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach as he watched it again, but this time he felt something else, too, a sense of strength. This video wasn't just a reminder of the worst moment of his life, it was proof of the injustice they had suffered. When it was the airline's turn, their lawyer, Mr. Jacobs, took a very different tone. He argued that the flight attendant had been merely following protocol, and that any discomfort Ethan and Rachel experienced was not a result of discrimination, but simple misunderstanding. He tried to paint the situation as a series of unfortunate events, with no malicious intent. Ava wasn't having it. When she stood to cross-examine Stephanie, the tension in the room rose. "You claimed that you were following protocol, Ms. Stephanie," Ava began, her voice sharp yet controlled. "But isn't it true that you never spoke to any other passengers before singling out Ethan and his aunt?" Stephanie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I didn't think it was necessary. They were the ones causing the problem." Ava's eyes narrowed. Yet, according to multiple witnesses, Ethan and his aunt were doing nothing disruptive. In fact, they were quiet and keeping to themselves. "So why did you single them out?" Stephanie hesitated, her gaze flickering to Mr. Jacobs, who gave her a brief, reassuring nod. "I just had a feeling something wasn't right." A feeling, Ava pressed. "Do you often act on feelings rather than facts when dealing with passengers?" Stephanie flushed, her confidence faltering. "No, but—" Ava cut her off. "It's clear that Ethan and his aunt were targeted based on assumptions. Assumptions that were informed by nothing more than their appearance." Ethan watched as Ava systematically dismantled the airline's defense, her every question revealing the truth that had been hidden behind corporate language and vague explanations. The more Stephanie spoke, the more obvious it became that what had happened wasn't just an innocent mistake, it was a clear case of racial profiling. By the second day of the trial, the airline's defense was crumbling. Witness after witness testified on Ethan and Rachel's behalf, including several passengers who had been on the plane that day. Even Mrs. Langley, the elderly woman who had sat next to them, took the stand, her kind voice unwavering as she defended Ethan's innocence. The pressure was mounting, and the airline knew it. As the courtroom reconvened after lunch on the third day, Mr. Jacobs stood up, his face uncharacteristically tense. "Your Honor, before we proceed, my client would like to request a brief recess to discuss a possible settlement." The courtroom buzzed with surprise. Rachel's eyes widened as she glanced at Jonathan and Ava. A settlement meant the airline knew they were likely to lose if the case continued. But what kind of settlement would they offer? The judge granted the recess, and the lawyers met in private. Ethan and Rachel waited anxiously, their nerves on edge. After what felt like hours, Jonathan and Ava returned, their faces unreadable. "They're offering a settlement," Jonathan said, sitting down across from them. "A significant financial compensation plus a public apology." Rachel frowned. "That's it, no real changes." Ava nodded. "It's a decent offer, but it's clear they're trying to get away with as little as possible. They don't want to make any major policy changes, just pay you off and move on." Ethan felt his heart sink. Money and an apology weren't enough. This wasn't just about them anymore, it was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. Rachel met Ethan's eyes, and he knew what she was thinking. They hadn't come this far just to settle for money and words. They needed real change. "What do you want to do?" Jonathan asked, his voice gentle but serious. Rachel looked at Ethan, her expression determined. "We need more than an apology. We need them to commit to actual policy changes. Diversity training for their staff, accountability for discrimination, something that shows they're taking this seriously." Jonathan and Ava exchanged glances, then nodded. "All right," Ava said. "We'll counter with those terms. If they're serious about wanting this to end quietly, they'll agree. If not, well, take this all the way to a verdict." The next few hours were agonizing. Ethan and Rachel waited as the lawyers negotiated behind closed doors. The tension in the air was thick, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a little afraid. What if the airline refused? What if they kept fighting, dragging the trial out for weeks, maybe months? But then Jonathan and Ava returned, and this time they were smiling. "They agreed," Ava said, her eyes sparkling with triumph. "Full settlement, public apology, diversity training for their staff, and new policies to prevent discrimination." Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Ethan, her eyes shining with relief. "We did it!" Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him, relief, pride, and a strange sense of closure. They had fought for justice, and they had won. The days following the settlement were a whirlwind. The airline issued a public apology, admitting that what had happened to Ethan and Rachel was wrong. They promised to implement the new policies and training, ensuring that their employees would be better equipped to handle similar situations in the future. The apology was broadcast on national news, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He and Rachel watched the airline's CEO deliver the apology from the comfort of their living room, both of them quiet as the weight of the moment sank in. "This is because of you," Rachel said softly, turning to Ethan. "Because you were brave enough to stand up for what was right." Ethan felt his cheeks flush with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, leaning into her. The changes didn't stop at the apology. The airline's diversity training began almost immediately, with reports coming in about their staff attending workshops and learning about racial bias. They also announced the creation of a scholarship fund for minority students interested in pursuing careers in aviation, something Ethan hadn't even dared to hope for. The scholarship fund, named after Ethan, was a direct result of their fight. It was a way for the airline to give back and ensure that future generations wouldn't have to face the same kind of discrimination. Ethan felt a sense of pride every time he heard about the fund. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been made to feel small or powerless. It was a victory for kids who might look different, but deserved the same respect and opportunities as anyone else. Months passed, and life slowly began to return to normal. But things were different for Ethan now. He wasn't just the quiet kid who had been kicked off a plane. He was someone who had stood up for what was right and helped create real change. He and Rachel continued to receive messages of support from people all over the country. Schools invited him to speak to students about his experience, and even though he still felt nervous in front of crowds, he found that every time he shared his story, it got a little easier. One day, as Ethan and Rachel were packing their bags for another trip, this time to attend an event in Washington, D.C. for civil rights awareness, Rachel turned to Ethan with a smile. "You ready for this?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Ethan looked down at his packed bag and then back at Rachel. "More than ready," he said with a grin. As they boarded their plane, the flight attendants greeted them warmly, recognizing them immediately. One of the attendants, a young woman with bright eyes and a genuine smile, approached them before takeoff. "It's an honor to have you on board," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "Your story has inspired so many of us." Ethan smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. The memory of that terrible day still lingered, but it no longer held the same power over him. He had faced the worst, and he had come out stronger. As the plane soared through the clouds, Ethan looked out the window, feeling a deep sense of pride and accomplishment. The fight wasn't over, there was still work to be done, but he knew that he and Rachel had made a real difference. They had shown the world that one voice, no matter how young or small, could change things for the better. And as they flew high above the world, Ethan felt hopeful for the future's future, and the future of everyone who believed in justice. Parents of current students began to express their concerns, worried that the controversy surrounding the school would affect their children's education and the school's reputation. The school's donors, many of whom had been longtime supporters, started to distance themselves from the administration, worried about being associated with an institution embroiled in a racial discrimination lawsuit. Some of Brookwood's most influential alumni began speaking out, urging the school to take responsibility and resolve the matter. Inside the school, tensions were running high. Teachers and staff were walking on eggshells, unsure of what would happen next. Some faculty members were quietly supportive of the Carters, but many were afraid to speak out, fearing repercussions from the administration. Meanwhile, Mr. Graham, who had once appeared confident and untouchable, was starting to show signs of strain. The board of directors was divided. A growing number of board members, led by Emily Henderson, were pushing for the school to settle the lawsuit and admit Jasmine and Chloe back into the student body. Others, however, still clung to the idea of maintaining Brookwood's tradition and refused to concede any wrongdoing. At a tense board meeting, the fault lines became clear. Emily Henderson, emboldened by her decision to leak the emails to the Carters, spoke out forcefully against the administration's handling of the situation. "We are facing a crisis, and we need to take responsibility," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "We cannot continue to pretend that this is a misunderstanding." This is about systemic racism, and we have a chance to make real change. But if we don't act now, we will destroy everything this school stands for. Dr. Harold Brown, a long-standing member of the board, responded coldly. Brookwood has stood for centuries because we have maintained our values. We cannot afford to let outside pressure dictate how we run this institution. This lawsuit is an attack on everything we've built. Emily didn't back down. What we've built is exclusionary and outdated. If we don't evolve, we will be left behind. This isn't just about Jasmine and Chloe Carter. This is about every student who has been denied a chance because of the color of their skin. We need to be better. The room fell into a tense silence. Mr. Graham sat at the head of the table, his face tight with frustration. He knew that the tide was turning against him, but he wasn't ready to give up the fight just yet. "We'll discuss this further," he said finally, his voice clipped. "But for now, we need to focus on defending the school's reputation." As the meeting ended, Emily left the room, her heart heavy. She knew that change wouldn't come easily, but she was determined to keep pushing. The future of the school and the fight for justice depended on it. As the lawsuit dragged on and the media coverage continued, the strain on the Carter family reached a breaking point. Despite their best efforts to stay united, the constant pressure was taking its toll on everyone. Ethan and Vanessa were both exhausted emotionally, mentally, and physically. Jasmine was doing her best to stay strong, but Chloe had retreated further into herself, barely speaking at all. One evening, after a long day of meetings with lawyers and media interviews, Ethan and Vanessa sat in their living room, the weight of their exhaustion palpable in the air. The tension between them, which had been building for weeks, finally erupted. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan," Vanessa said, her voice shaking with frustration. "This fight is consuming everything. It's consuming us. I barely see the girls anymore. I barely see you." Ethan rubbed his temples, his own exhaustion evident. "What do you want me to do, Vanessa? Walk away. Let them get away with it. You know we can't do that." "I'm not saying we should walk away," Vanessa shot back, her voice rising. "But this fight is tearing our family apart. Chloe is shutting down, Jasmine is pushing herself too hard, and we're both stretched so thin we can barely keep it together. Something has to give." Ethan stood up, pacing the room, his frustration boiling over. "You think I don't see that? You think I don't know what this is doing to us? But what's the alternative? If we stop now, what does that say to Jasmine and Chloe? That we can't fight for them? That, well, let people like Graham win?" Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared, Ethan. I'm scared we're going to lose our family in the process of fighting for justice. I don't want that. I don't want to look back and realize we lost everything that really matters." Ethan stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew she was right. The fight for justice had become all-consuming, and in the process, he had lost sight of what was most important's family. He sat back down, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to lose us either," he said softly. "But I don't know how to do both, how to fight and still protect our family." Vanessa wiped her tears and took a deep breath. "We can't do it alone, Ethan. We need to lean on each other more. We need to take care of the girls, take care of ourselves. Well, keep fighting, but we have to find a way to do it without losing ourselves in the process." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "You're right. We'll find a way." That night, for the first time in weeks, Ethan and Vanessa made a conscious decision to step back from the fight, at least for a little while. They spent the evening with Jasmine and Chloe, watching movies, playing board games, and trying to create a sense of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. For a few hours, the weight of the lawsuit and the public scrutiny lifted, and the Carters were just a family again. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a starter reminder of what they were fighting for and why they couldn't give up. After their emotional confrontation, Ethan and Vanessa committed to finding a better balance between their fight for justice and the emotional well-being of their family. They began scheduling time each day to focus solely on Jasmine and Chloe, setting aside the demands of the lawsuit and media for those moments when they could just be a family again. Jasmine, ever the high achiever, struggled with the idea of stepping back from her intense focus on proving herself. But after a heartfelt conversation with her parents, She began to realize that her worth wasn't tied to the expectations of Brookwood or society at large. "I feel like I have to keep proving that I belong," Jasmine admitted one afternoon, sitting with Ethan and Vanessa in the backyard. "Like if I let up for even a second, people will think I don't deserve to be here." Vanessa placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Jasmine, you've already proven that 1,000 times over. You don't have to carry that weight alone. The people who doubt you are wrong, not you. Don't let their narrow views dictate how you see yourself." Ethan nodded in agreement. "You belong, Jasmine. Not because of what you've done, but because of who you are. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." Chloe, who had been sitting quietly next to her sister, finally spoke up. "I just wish it didn't feel like such a battle. I wish we didn't have to fight so hard just to be seen." Ethan's heart ached at his younger daughter's words. He had always known that the world was unfair, but hearing the pain in Chloe's voice made the injustice even more personal. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I know, baby. I wish the same thing," he said softly. "But we're changing things, little by little. Every time we stand up, every time we push back, we're making it easier for the next person who comes after us." Chloe leaned into her father, feeling the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of safety, knowing that her family was there for her no matter what. As the days went on, the Carters found small ways to heal. They took walks together, had family dinners, and spent time laughing and talking about things other than the lawsuit. Slowly, the tension that had been suffocating them began to lift, and they rediscovered the joy in being together as a family. But even as they healed, they knew that the fight was far from over. The lawsuit loomed large, and the media continued to follow their every move. Still, they were stronger now, more united than ever, and ready to face whatever came next. With their family back on more solid ground, the Carters refocused on the legal battle ahead. Armed with the emails from Emily Henderson and the growing public support for their case, they were ready to take the next step, bringing the evidence to light in court. Vanessa and her legal team filed the emails as part of their discovery process, making them public as they prepared for trial. The documents were explosive, revealing Brookwood Academy's discriminatory practices in black and white terms. The school's legal team had no choice but to acknowledge the gravity of the evidence, and the public's reaction was swift and furious. News outlets ran headlines like "Leaked Emails," "Show Racism at Elite Private School," and "Brookwood Academy Caught in Discrimination Scandal." Social media erupted with calls for the resignation of Mr. Graham and other school leaders, and the pressure on the school's administration intensified. Protests outside the school grew larger, with civil rights groups joining forces to demand accountability. Parents of current students began to withdraw their children from the school, unwilling to be associated with an institution tainted by racism. Donors, too, started pulling their funding, threatening Brookwood's financial stability. Mr. Graham, who had once seemed untouchable, was now on the verge of losing everything. Inside the school, teachers and staff were growing increasingly uneasy, and whispers of a potential leadership change were circulating. The school board, divided for weeks, was now leaning toward taking drastic action to save the school's reputation. At a pivotal board meeting, Emily Henderson made her case once again. "We can't continue to ignore this," she said, her voice firm but measured. "The evidence is clear. We need to admit fault, settle the lawsuit, and start making real changes. If we don't, Brookwood won't survive." The other board members, who had been reluctant to take such a step, finally seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Even Dr. Harold Brown, who had staunchly defended the school's traditional values, remained silent, his resistance worn down by the undeniable truth. As the board voted to settle the lawsuit and initiate a complete overhaul of the school's admissions policies, the tide had officially turned. Brookwood Academy would never be the same again. In the weeks following the board's decision to settle the lawsuit, Brookwood Academy underwent a dramatic transformation. The first and most significant change came with the resignation of Mr. Graham, who was quietly removed from his position as headmaster. Publicly, the school framed it as a retirement, but everyone knew the truth. he had been forced out in disgrace. The board appointed Professor Emily Henderson as interim headmistress, a clear sign that the school was serious about reform. Her first act was to hold a series of town hall meetings with parents, students, and faculty to discuss the changes that were coming. She made it clear that Brookwood was committed to rebuilding its reputation by creating a more inclusive and equitable environment. Jasmine and Chloe, who had been following the developments closely, were invited back to Brookwood as part of the settlement. But it wasn't just about getting them back into the school, it was about making sure the changes were real and lasting. "I want to make sure this isn't just a PR move," Jasmine said during a family discussion. "I don't want to go back to a school that's only pretending to change." Vanessa nodded. "Well, make sure of that. Well, hold them accountable." Chloe, who had been quieter throughout the process, finally spoke up. "I want to go back, but I want it to be different. I want to feel like we belong." Ethan smiled softly at his daughters. "You will. You've earned your place, and you'll help shape the future of that school." As Brookwood implemented new policies, revising its admissions criteria, creating diversity and inclusion programs, and recruiting students from a wider range of backgrounds, Jasmine and Chloe became part of a new chapter in the school's history. They returned to Brookwood not just as students, but as symbols of change. The internal struggle within the school wasn't over, though. There were still those who resisted the changes, parents and alumni who clung to the old ways. But the tide had shifted, and Brookwood was on a path to becoming a more inclusive institution. For the Carters, the journey had been long and difficult, but they had emerged stronger, both as a family and as advocates for justice. They had fought not just for their daughters, but for every student who had ever been denied a seat at the table. As the court date approached, the anticipation weighed heavily on the Carter family. The lawsuit had garnered national attention, and the pressure was immense. The trial wasn't just about Jasmine and Chloe anymore, had become a defining moment in the fight for racial justice in education. Vanessa, who had been working tirelessly with their legal team, was ready for battle. She had rehearsed every point, every argument, and had poured herself into preparing for the trial. It wasn't just personal for her as a mother, as a lawyer. This case was her chance to set a legal precedent that would affect schools across the country. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Journalists, activists, and legal experts filled the gallery, while outside, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Equality for all and end racial discrimination in schools." It was clear that the outcome of this case would have far-reaching consequences. Jasmine and Chloe sat quietly beside their parents, their faces tense but determined. They had both insisted on being present, knowing that this fight was as much theirs as it was their parents'. They were nervous, but they were ready. The trial began with opening statements from both sides. Thomas Aldridge, Brookwood Academy's lead attorney, spoke first. His tone was polished and measured as he outlined the school's defense, carefully avoiding any direct mention of race. Instead, he framed the case around the school's right to maintain its standards and values, using vague language to distance the administration from any accusations of bias. "This case is not about discrimination," Aldridge said, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. "This case is about the right of a private institution to make decisions based on a holistic evaluation of each student." Brookwood Academy has, for decades, prided itself on creating a balanced and inclusive environment. The plaintiff's accusations are based on misinterpretation and personal grievance, not fact. Vanessa sat quietly, her face unreadable. She had expected Brookwood's legal team to sidestep the real issue and cloak their discrimination in the guise of academic standards. When it was her turn to speak, Vanessa rose, her presence commanding. She addressed the court with the same intensity she had brought to every legal battle of her career. But this time, there was something deeper, a mother's fierce resolve to protect her children. "This case," Vanessa began, her voice clear and strong, "is not about academic standards or maintaining school values. It's about race. It's about exclusion. It's about a system that has long operated under the guise of neutrality while quietly upholding practices designed to keep people like my daughters out." The evidence will show that Brookwood Academy did not reject Jasmine and Chloe Carter because they failed to meet academic requirements. They were rejected because they did not fit into the school's narrow definition of who belongs. Vanessa's words hung in the air as the courtroom fell silent, the weight of her accusations sinking in. Over the next several days, the trial unfolded with testimony from both sides. The Carters' legal team presented the leaked emails from Emily Henderson, which clearly revealed the discriminatory conversations between Brookwood's headmaster and the admissions committee. The emails showed how phrases like cultural fit and maintaining our identity were used to justify the exclusion of students of color. Emily Henderson herself took the stand, testifying about the discussions she had witnessed during her time on the board. Her testimony was a turning point in the trial. She described in detail how Mr. Graham had led the effort to push out Jasmine and Chloe, fearing backlash from wealthy conservative donors. "I joined Brookwood's board to help modernize the school," Emily said, her voice steady but emotional. "But I quickly realized that the administration was more interested in maintaining the status quo than in promoting diversity and inclusion." When Jasmine and Chloe Carter were admitted, there were immediate concerns about how their presence would fit with the school's existing community. These concerns had nothing to do with their academic qualifications and everything to do with their race. Aldridge tried to discredit Emily's testimony, suggesting that she was biased because of her progressive views, but it was clear that her words had struck a chord. The jury listened intently, and the mood in the courtroom shifted. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and arguments from both sides, the trial reached its final day. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury prepared to deliver their verdict. The Carters sat together, their hands intertwined, bracing for whatever was to come. The jury foreman stood and addressed the court. "In the case of Carter versus Brookwood Academy, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom as the words sank in. The Carters had won. Tears filled Vanessa's eyes as she squeezed Ethan's hand. Jasmine and Chloe, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, finally let out the breath they had been holding. It was over. They had won. The jury found that Brookwood Academy had indeed engaged in discriminatory practices and had violated Jasmine and Chloe's right to an equal education. The school was ordered to pay damages to the Carters, but more importantly, they were required to make immediate changes to their admissions policies, ensuring that no student would ever again be rejected based on race. The media erupted with the news. Headlines declared the Carters' victory as a landmark case in the fight against racial discrimination in private education. Civil rights groups hailed the decision as a major step forward, and parents across the country began to look more closely at the policies of their children's schools. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered. Supporters cheered as the Carter family emerged, holding their heads high. Ethan addressed the crowd, his voice filled with pride and emotion. "This victory is not just for my daughters," Ethan said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "This is for every student who has ever been told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. This is for every family who has had to fight just to be seen, just to be heard. We are not done fighting, but today we take a step forward. Today justice was served." The crowd roared in response, and Jasmine and Chloe smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. They had fought hard, and now they could finally begin to heal. In the wake of the verdict, Brookwood Academy faced a reckoning unlike anything it had experienced in its long history. The school's reputation had been severely damaged by the trial, and Mr. Graham's resignation was not enough to stem the tide of criticism. Under the leadership of Emily Henderson, who had been appointed as the new headmistress following the verdict, Brookwood began to make the changes mandated by the court. Emily wasted no time in overhauling the admissions process, removing the vague cultural fit criteria that had been used to discriminate against students of color. In its place, she implemented new policies designed to ensure transparency and fairness, with a focus on promoting diversity and inclusion. But it wasn't just the admissions process that needed reform. Brookwood's culture had to change as well. Emily worked with faculty and students to create programs that would foster a more inclusive environment, where all students, regardless of race, felt welcome and valued. She introduced workshops on racial bias and privilege, brought in guest speakers from diverse backgrounds, and encouraged open discussions about race and equity. For some members of the Brookwood community, these changes were long overdue. Teachers who had quietly supported the Carters throughout the trial were finally able to speak out, sharing their own experiences of witnessing discrimination at the school. Parents who had been hesitant to get involved in the controversy now voiced their support for the new direction the school was taking. But not everyone was on board. A vocal minority of parents and alumni resisted the changes, claiming that Brookwood was abandoning its traditions in favor of political correctness. Some families withdrew their children from the school, and a few of the school's wealthiest donors cut off their financial support in protest. Despite these challenges, Emily remained steadfast. She knew that real change would take time, but she was determined to lead Brookwood into a new era where every student, regardless of background, had an equal opportunity to succeed. As for Mr. Graham, his departure from Brookwood was swift and quiet. He had once been a powerful figure in the world of elite education, but the trial had tarnished his reputation beyond repair. He retired from public life, leaving behind a legacy of exclusion and prejudice that Brookwood was now working to undo. The day finally came when Jasmine and Chloe would return to Brookwood Academy. It was a day they had both anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. The school was different now. There were new faces, new policies, and a new atmosphere of openness, but it was still the same place where they had been rejected, where they had felt like outsiders. As they walked through the gates hand in hand, Jasmine and Chloe were met with curious glances from their peers. Some students smiled, offering tentative waves of welcome. Others, the ones who had always seen them as outsiders, looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the change that had come to Brookwood. But Jasmine and Chloe didn't let the stares or the whispers deter them. They walked into the building with their heads held high, knowing that they had earned their place here, not just because of their academic achievements, but because of the fight they had won. The first few weeks were challenging. Jasmine, always driven, threw herself back into her studies, determined to succeed on her own terms. Chloe, still more reserved, found solace in her art classes, where she could express the emotions she had been carrying for so long. Both girls had moments of doubt, moments where they wondered if they would ever truly feel at home at Brookwood. But slowly, as the school adjusted to its new reality, they began to find their footing. Teachers, many of whom had quietly supported the Carters throughout their ordeal, went out of their way to make sure Jasmine and Chloe felt included. Fellow students who had once been distant now reached out, inviting them to study groups and extracurricular activities. Bit by bit, the school began to feel less like a battleground and more like a place where they could thrive. One afternoon, as Jasmine and Chloe were leaving school, they stopped by the newly created Diversity and Inclusion Office, which had been established as part of the school's reforms. Inside, they saw a group of younger students, Black, Latino, Asian, gathered around a table, discussing ideas for a new student-led initiative to promote equity at Brookwood. Jasmine smiled as she watched them. She turned to Chloe, her voice filled with quiet pride. "This is why we fought. So they wouldn't have to." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah, we did it." As they walked out of the building, the sun setting behind them, the weight of the past year finally began to lift. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had emerged stronger, not just for themselves, but for the students who would come after them. Months after the trial, Ethan sat in his office, reflecting on the journey his family had been through. The fight had been long and grueling, but they had won. And while the victory in court had been important, it was the deeper, more personal victories that meant the most to him. He thought about Jasmine and Chloe, how they had grown into strong, resilient young women over the course of the battle. He thought about Vanessa, who had fought alongside him every step of the way, balancing her roles as lawyer, mother, and advocate with grace and determination. He thought about the moments when it had seemed like they might lose everything, but somehow they had found the strength to keep going. As a senator, Ethan had always believed in the power of the law to bring about change. But this case had taught him something deeper, that real change comes not just from legal victories, but from the courage to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and we won't accept it." He knew that their fight wasn't over. The issues they had faced at Brookwood were just a small part of the larger system of inequality that permeated society. But their victory had shown that change was possible, that the system could be challenged, and that families like his could make a difference. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long while he felt hopeful. They had won one battle, but there were many more to fight. And with his family by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. The Carter family's victory in court had sent shockwaves through the country, igniting conversations about racial inequality and systemic discrimination in education. The case had become a touchstone for civil rights activists, educators, and families who had experienced similar discrimination in other schools. It wasn't long before other institutions began to face scrutiny, with families stepping forward to challenge discriminatory practices at private and public schools alike. The Carter case had not only reshaped Brookwood Academy, but it had also sparked a movement. Across social media, hashtags like Justice for All Students and Equal Education for All trended for weeks, with thousands of people sharing their stories of exclusion and discrimination. Civil rights organizations used the momentum to push for new policies that would address racial disparities in schools nationwide. Ethan, who had always been a vocal advocate for equal rights, was now thrust into the national spotlight. As a senator, his platform had expanded, and he used it to champion legislative reform aimed at dismantling systemic barriers in education. He proposed a bill that would mandate stricter oversight of private school admissions processes, ensuring transparency and preventing discrimination based on race, socioeconomic status, or other factors. "This is just the beginning," Ethan said during a televised interview, his voice resolute. "We've taken a step forward, but we have a long way to go. Every child deserves an equal opportunity to succeed, no matter where they come from or what they look like. We won't stop fighting until that's a reality." The bill gained traction in Congress, with bipartisan support from lawmakers who recognized the importance of addressing inequality in education. Ethan found himself working closely with civil rights leaders, community organizers, and fellow politicians to build a coalition that would push the bill forward. Meanwhile, Vanessa was also making an impact. As a high-profile lawyer with expertise in discrimination cases, she became a sought-after speaker at conferences and legal forums where she discussed the implications of the Carter case and the need for ongoing legal reform. She received invitations to speak at law schools where students were eager to learn from her experience and insight. "I've always believed that the law is a tool for justice," Vanessa said during one such event. "But it's only as powerful as the people who wield it. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep using the law to hold institutions accountable." The Carter case wasn't just a win for my family, it was a win for every family that has ever faced discrimination. For Jasmine and Chloe, the ripple effect of their case was deeply personal. They began receiving messages from students all over the country, many of whom shared their own experiences of feeling like outsiders in predominantly white institutions. Jasmine, in particular, felt a responsibility to respond to these messages, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. One day, Jasmine received a letter from a young girl in Texas who had been rejected from a prestigious private school under similar circumstances. The girl wrote about how she had been told she didn't fit the culture of the school, despite her academic qualifications. She had felt defeated, but after reading about the Carter case, she decided to fight back. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself," the girl wrote. "Thank you for showing me that I deserve a place at the table, no matter what anyone says." Jasmine was moved to tears as she read the letter. She realized that their fight hadn't just been for themselves, it had been for every student who had ever been told they didn't belong. And now, those students were finding their voices and pushing back against the system. At Brookwood Academy, the changes initiated by Emily Henderson continued to transform the school. With new policies in place, the admissions process became more transparent, and the focus shifted toward building a truly inclusive community. The school's Diversity and Inclusion Office, created in the wake of the lawsuit, became a central hub for student-led initiatives aimed at promoting equity and addressing bias. One of the first major changes was the formation of a student advisory board, which included representatives from different racial, cultural, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Jasmine and Chloe were invited to join the board, and while they were initially hesitant, they saw it as an opportunity to help shape the future of Brookwood. The first meeting of the advisory board was filled with nervous energy as students from different grades and backgrounds gathered to discuss their visions for the school. Jasmine, who had always been more outspoken, took the lead, while Chloe offered her quiet but insightful input. "We need to make sure that the changes we're making aren't just on paper," Jasmine said during the meeting. "It's not enough to change the admissions process, we need to change the way people think. We need to create a culture where everyone feels like they belong, no matter who they are." The other students nodded in agreement, and soon the conversation flowed freely, with ideas for workshops, cultural events, and mentorship programs aimed at fostering understanding and unity within the student body. Under Emily's leadership, Brookwood also began reaching out to communities that had been historically underrepresented at the school. They partnered with local organizations to recruit students from diverse backgrounds and provided scholarships to ensure that financial barriers wouldn't prevent deserving students from attending. Emily herself worked tirelessly to rebuild trust within the Brookwood community. She held regular town hall meetings with parents and faculty, where she addressed concerns and shared updates on the school's progress. She made it clear that Brookwood was committed to becoming a leader in educational equity. And while some parents remained resistant, the majority embraced the changes. One afternoon, as Jasmine and Chloe were leaving school, they stopped to talk with Emily, who was walking across the campus. "You've both done so much to help make these changes happen," Emily said, her voice warm with admiration. "Brookwood is better because of you." Jasmine smiled, feeling a sense of pride. "It wasn't just us. A lot of people fought to make this happen." "True," Emily replied, "but you were the spark that ignited the change." As Jasmine and Chloe walked away, they reflected on how far they had come. They had once felt like outsiders, unsure of their place at Brookwood, but now they were part of something much bigger, a movement toward a more just and inclusive future. While Brookwood Academy was undergoing a transformation, the Carter family was focused on rebuilding trust, both within their own family and in the community. The emotional toll of the lawsuit and the public scrutiny had been immense, but now that the battle was behind them, they were beginning to heal. Ethan and Vanessa, who had always been a strong team, took time to reconnect with each other and with their daughters. They made a conscious effort to spend more time together as a family, away from the pressures of their respective careers. Weekend trips, family dinners, and quiet evenings at home became a regular part of their routine. For Jasmine and Chloe, the process of rebuilding trust within themselves was more personal. The past year had tested their resilience, but it had also taught them important lessons about their own strength and the power of their voices. Jasmine, who had always felt the need to prove herself academically, began to let go of the idea that her worth was tied to her achievements. She realized that her place at Brookwood wasn't something she had to justify, it was something she had earned. She also started to explore her interests outside of academics, joining the school's debate team and getting involved in student government. Chloe, who had struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, found solace in her art. She began to use her creativity as an outlet for her emotions, expressing through painting and drawing what she couldn't always put into words. Her art teacher noticed her talent and encouraged her to showcase her work in the school's annual art exhibit. "I didn't think anyone would want to see my stuff," Chloe admitted one afternoon, as she showed her parents one of her latest paintings. Vanessa smiled, admiring the vibrant colors and intricate details of Chloe's work. "Your art is beautiful, Chloe. You have a gift, and the world deserves to see it." With her parents' encouragement, Chloe agreed to submit her work to the exhibit. On the day of the event, as students and parents wandered through the gallery, Chloe watched nervously from the sidelines, unsure of how her art would be received. But as people stopped to admire her paintings, offering compliments, and asking about her process, she felt a sense of validation she hadn't expected. One of the visitors to the exhibit was Professor Reynolds, the board member who had supported the changes at Brookwood. He paused in front of one of Chloe's paintings, studying it carefully. "This is remarkable," he said, turning to Chloe with a smile. "You have a real talent." Chloe blushed, feeling both proud and shy at the same time. "Thank you. It means a lot." As the evening went on, Chloe realized that she had found her place not just as a student at Brookwood, but as an artist with a voice of her own. The Carter family had been through a storm, but they had come out stronger on the other side. With the lawsuit behind them and Brookwood Academy on a new path, they were ready to focus on what mattered most to each other. One summer evening, the family gathered in their backyard for a barbecue, a tradition they had started before the chaos of the lawsuit had consumed their lives. The smell of grilled food filled the air as they laughed and talked, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. Jasmine and Chloe sat on the patio, reminiscing about their first day at Brookwood and how much had changed since then. "I never thought we'd get through all of that," Jasmine said, sipping lemonade. "But here we are." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad we didn't give up. It was hard, but we made it." Ethan joined them, holding a plate of burgers and hot dogs. He smiled at his daughters, pride radiating from him. "You two are the strongest people I know. You fought for what was right, and you made a difference." Vanessa, carrying a bowl of salad, sat down beside Ethan. She placed a hand on his arm, her expression filled with love and gratitude. "We all made a difference, and we did it together." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, the Carters sat around the table eating and laughing. The weight of the past year finally lifted. They knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. That night, as Jasmine and Chloe sat outside, looking up at the stars, they reflected on how far they had come. They had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of their place in the world. "I think we're going to be okay," Chloe said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. Jasmine smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, we're going to be just fine." Months after the lawsuit had ended, the Carter family continued to move forward, both personally and professionally. Ethan's proposed bill on educational reform was gaining momentum in Congress, with support from lawmakers across the political spectrum. The bill aimed to establish nationwide guidelines for private school admissions, ensuring that no student would be discriminated against based on race, socioeconomic status, or background. On the day of the vote, Ethan stood in the Senate chamber, addressing his colleagues with the same passion that had driven him throughout the Brookwood case. "This bill is about fairness," he said, his voice steady but powerful. "It's about giving every child a fair shot at success. It's about ensuring that no student is ever told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. We've come a long way, but we still have work to do. And it starts here, with this bill." As the vote was cast, the bill passed with overwhelming support, marking a major victory in the fight for educational equity. Ethan, standing in the Senate chamber, allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The fight was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued to work on cases related to racial discrimination, using her platform to advocate for families facing similar challenges. She became a mentor to young lawyers, sharing her knowledge and experience to help them navigate the complexities of civil rights law. For Jasmine and Chloe, life at Brookwood had settled into a new normal. They continued to thrive academically, but they also made time for the things they loved: debating, painting, and building friendships with students from all walks of life. One afternoon, as the sisters sat in the school library, Chloe looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at Jasmine. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Chloe asked. Jasmine thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't like to think about that. What matters is that we did fight, and because of that, everything changed." Chloe nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We should be proud of that." "We are," Jasmine said, her voice filled with certainty. "We made a difference." As the sisters packed up their things and headed out of the library, they knew that their fight had been worth it. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, and they had helped pave the way for a future where every student, regardless of race or background, could walk through the doors of opportunity with their head held high. The road ahead was long, but the Carters were ready for it. Thank you so much for following the Carter family's journey to justice and equality. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about powerful narratives that challenge society, inspire change, and explore the human experience, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on new content. Together, we can continue to share stories that matter. See you in the next one. The police are on their way, Derek. You've lost. Derek's eyes darted around, realizing for the first time that the entire street was watching him. His bravado faltered, his shoulders tensing as he took in the growing crowd of neighbors, all standing together in a show of solidarity. For a moment, it seemed like Derek might lash out, might do something reckless. But then slowly, the fight drained out of him. His fists unclenched, his shoulders slumped, and with one last look at Edith filled with hatred and resentment, he turned and stormed back to his car. The street was silent as Derek sped away, his tires screeching against the pavement. Edith's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She stood there for a moment, frozen, until Bill crossed the street and stood beside her. "You okay, Edith?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Edith nodded, though her legs still felt shaky. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to all of you." Bill smiled warmly, giving her a reassuring nod. "We're not going to let him hurt you, Edith. Not now, not ever." Edith's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of gratitude. She had been afraid for so long, but now, standing here with her neighbors by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone. In the days following the final confrontation with Derek, the neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the sense of fear that had once gripped Cedar Street began to dissipate. Derek hadn't returned, and Edith had received word from the police that he was being closely monitored. They had issued a restraining order, preventing Derek from coming within a certain distance of Edith's home or the shelter where Rachel and the girls were staying. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give Edith peace of mind for now. Rachel called regularly, checking in to see how Edith was doing and updating her on their progress. The shelter had helped her find legal representation, and she was working towards securing full custody of the girls and filing for divorce from Derek. It was a long, difficult road, but Rachel was determined to keep moving forward. "The girls are adjusting," Rachel said during one phone call, her voice sounding stronger, more confident. "They're starting to sleep better, and we're getting used to our new routine. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free." Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors' sons, strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done. But now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith." "Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. You'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better now, richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.